It was a small town, the kind where faces seem familiar, but every street holds a mystery. I hadn't planned to stop there, but a series of minor misfortunes led me to that area, forgotten by maps and well-known routes. The idea was to take a break from my routine, a temporary fresh start while I dealt with some pending decisions, perhaps even find some inspiration. I managed to rent an old house on the outskirts, far enough to avoid disturbance, and I believed that the isolation would do me good. From the very first night, I sensed that something was peculiar about that place. The wooden floors of the house creaked constantly, as if there was movement where there shouldn't be. I knew that many old buildings behave this way, but there was a strange frequency to the sound, a repetition that left me unsettled. The house hadn't been lived in for quite some time, and the strong smell of the old furniture indicated that the place had been untouched for years. The neighborhood was uninviting too. The town seemed to fall asleep far too early, and the silence outside felt absolute, as if people avoided any contact after dark. During the day, I would go out to explore, but I felt discreet glances from some residents, the kind typical of towns unaccustomed to new faces. And while I tried to mingle a little, there seemed to be a resistance on their part. The interactions were brief, almost automatic, as if I were breaking a routine established for decades. On the third night, I had a disturbing dream. I was walking through the house, but the rooms were different, as if there was an extra structure I had never seen. At the end of a long corridor, I saw a door that hadn't been there during the day. Something inside me hesitated to open it, but in the dream, my feet moved on their own, pushing the door open. Behind it, a deep darkness seemed to swallow the space, a darkness so dense it felt almost tangible. I woke up sweating, with an uncomfortable feeling I couldn't immediately identify. This dream began to repeat on the following nights, each time with greater intensity. What had initially been a curiosity about what I might find transformed into a difficult-to-contain anxiety, as if something were urging me to move down that corridor toward the unknown. During the day, I tried to ignore the dream and focus on my walks around town, but each night I was confronted again with that door. On the fourth night, as I tried to fall asleep, I heard footsteps downstairs. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like someone walking leisurely, pausing at each corner. I froze for a moment, trying to discern whether I was just imagining things. With a trembling hand, I grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight and descended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. Upon reaching the living room, I found it empty. I looked around, trying to find any sign of an intrusion, but nothing seemed out of place. After that, I went back to my room, too afraid to turn off the light. I spent the rest of the night awake, my gaze fixed on the ceiling, waiting for the slightest sign of movement. Outside, the town remained in complete silence, and the thought that no one would be available to help bothered me more than I cared to admit. The next morning, I woke up with a clear objective: to uncover what was peculiar about the town and the place where I was staying. I left the house and walked toward the center, observing every detail around me. There was a small square that seemed to be the meeting point for residents, dominated by a church with a tower that stood out on the horizon. The building, although imposing, showed signs of wear and neglect, as if its importance had been forgotten. I entered a nearby grocery store and noticed that the owner, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, avoided making direct eye contact with me. When I asked about the town and mentioned my rented house, the man reacted with a strange look. He merely murmured that some places should be left alone, as if a subtle warning hung in the air. I was intrigued, but understood that any more direct answers would be unlikely. Returning to the house, I decided to explore the surrounding area, drawn by the feeling that something there was calling to me. Behind the property, a dirt road led to an area with ancient trees that formed a natural labyrinth. I followed the path and discovered a forgotten cabin, partially hidden by vegetation. The place showed signs of abandonment, but there were remnants indicating it had been used at some point recently. Inside the cabin, I found some torn pages from an old newspaper. One of the articles spoke of a disappearance that had occurred decades ago. Although the details were scant, a man's name was mentioned, someone who had vanished without a trace. I returned home with this information in mind, increasingly convinced that something unresolved lingered in that town. In my room, I decided I would stay awake all night, alert to any sounds or movements. As the night wore on, I heard strange noises throughout the house, sounds that seemed to drift between the rooms. Instead of hesitating, I decided to investigate. My instinct told me these signals might be related to the story of the missing man, or perhaps something deeper, something the town seemed to be hiding. The next morning, I resolved to return to the grocery store. I asked the owner if he knew the story of the missing man, but his reaction was one of discomfort. "Don't ask about that," he said, quickly turning away and ending the conversation. The feeling that the entire town was harboring a secret grew even stronger. Determined to understand more, I went back to the cabin. As I examined every corner, I found an inscription on the wall, something that seemed like a warning or a plea for help, though expressed in vague terms. This detail made me realize that my presence there might be reviving old stories, old memories, as if the place itself had been waiting for me to bring these issues to light. As I stepped away from the cabin, I noticed someone watching me from the nearby road. It was an elderly woman, staring at me with a curious gaze, almost as if she already knew the questions I carried. Without saying a word, she simply pointed to the church, as if that were the endpoint of the navigation. Following her gesture, I decided that my next stop would be there, at the heart of that town, which seemed to hold much more than it appeared. By late afternoon, I approached the church the elderly woman had indicated. The structure looked even more worn up close, yet it still held an imposing presence that made me hesitate to enter. As soon as I placed my hand on the door, a soft sound of footsteps echoed inside, followed by a deep, firm voice. "You're the outsider," said the man, not looking directly at me. He stood near the altar, adjusting some candles, and his posture suggested authority, perhaps the local priest. "I came to learn more about the town and the stories it hides," I replied, trying to mask my anxiety. The man lifted his gaze, sizing me up for a moment. "Some stories shouldn't be remembered, and those who seek them usually don't stay here long," he said, his voice a mix of weariness and warning. I decided to press on, pulling out the newspaper article I had found in the cabin and showing it to him. "Did you know this man? He disappeared decades ago, and people seem uncomfortable talking about it." The priest glanced at the newspaper, and a shadow of recognition crossed his face. He turned away, as if trying to avoid the memory, but something compelled him to speak. "There are places and people that should rest. This town has its scars, and some never heal." Before I could respond, he stepped closer, his expression now more intense. "If you want answers, go to the farmhouse on the north side. That's where the story ended, and where it might begin for you." The priest left in a hurry, leaving me there, absorbing his words. An odd sensation enveloped me, as if I were just steps away from something I couldn't fully grasp. Nevertheless, I decided to follow his suggestion, heading toward the farmhouse he mentioned. As I exited the church, I was surprised to see the same elderly woman who had pointed me there. She approached and spoke softly, as if every word were a secret someone might overhear. "You shouldn't go there, but if you do, take this." She placed a cold key in my hand, her gaze more intense than ever. "You may need it, should the past decide to resurface." I took the key, murmuring my thanks. Its weight felt significant, but its meaning only became clear when I arrived at the farmhouse as dusk fell. The structure was in ruins, but the gate was intact. Unlocking it, I found the key also fit the front door. I stepped inside, and a musty smell mixed with something indefinable filled the air. As I explored the place, I noticed old marks on the walls, as if someone had struggled to leave some kind of sign there. My heart raced, and then I heard a faint creak of wood. I turned to find the priest at the door, his expression more closed and stern than before. "Why do you insist on this?" he asked, his deep voice slicing through the silence. "Because it seems like no one else wants to resolve it," I replied. "You all avoid the answers, but I'm here to understand." He sighed deeply, but didn't seem surprised. "That man you see in the newspapers, he had secrets, things no one should know, but that ultimately drove him away. It wasn't the town that took him from here, it was himself. There's no point in looking for someone who no longer wants to be found." Before he could leave, I grabbed his arm, feeling the urgency of every second. But why? Why does everyone seem so pressured to forget? What are you hiding? The priest stared at me, and finally, in a voice almost devoid of life, he replied. What he carried was a burden, a weight, and it was by his choice that he hid. But some places hold fragments, and you found them. I felt a chill, not from what he said, but from how the truth seemed only to scratch the surface. I decided to follow the priest, who walked slowly out of the house, as if each step bore the weight of a memory he wished to bury. Do you really think he chose to hide? I asked, trying to read something more in his expression. He paused for a moment, turned around, and sighed. It's not about choice, it's about debt, about promises that can't be broken, not even after all this time. Debt? But to whom? This town feels more like a ghost than a place where people make deals, I replied, trying to understand. You're curious, he said, glancing at the house around us, where time seemed to have stopped. And curiosity comes at a price. Sometimes the answer is more dangerous than the question. I stepped into the main room, where a fireplace covered in old ashes stood out. Next to it, a framed photo showed a group of men in front of the same house decades ago. I recognized one of the faces. It was the missing man from the newspaper. I looked at the pastor, who was silently watching me. He's in that photo, isn't he? I asked, pointing to the image. Yes, he murmured, not coming any closer. And they all paid in some way. But who are they? What happened here? I pressed, feeling like every answer led to new questions. Back in the hallway, a cold draft swept past me, and all the doors on the upper floor swung open simultaneously. Outside, the trees swayed as if struck by an invisible gale. The priest stood still, his eyes fixed on the house, a grave expression overtaking his face. You still don't understand, do you? He said, his voice low. This house guards those who dare to know too much. Then why did you let me in? I asked, almost in a whisper, fearing the answer. I didn't let you in. You were brought here, he replied, stepping back as if preparing to leave. And it's not up to me to decide if you get out. Before I could ask more, a noise resonated behind me. I turned and saw a blurred figure in the entrance of one of the rooms. Its face was obscured, but the contours were familiar. The man from the photo, the missing man. The priest began to descend the stairs, his steps deliberate, while the figure slowly approached me. What do you want from me? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure remained silent, its eyes fixed on me. When it finally stopped, just a step away, an increasing pressure filled the space, as if the air around me had grown heavy. Then it spoke, its voice raspy and dragged out. The pact was not fulfilled, and those who dishonor it are called back. That's when I realized the house was not just a shelter for secrets, it was the very guardian of the pact. And everyone who entered was tested, challenged to resist its allure and keep what they knew. Those who failed remained forever. I didn't do anything, I stammered, but the priest, now at the bottom of the stairs, merely watched in silence. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the notebook fallen on the floor. The pages were blank except for a new sentence scrawled at the end. Your time has come. Time seemed to stop as I read those words. The notebook, now a symbol of what was at stake, made my heart race. The silence became deafening, and panic began to spread. Hey! I shouted, calling out to the priest, but he was no longer there. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I knew I had to get out. I ran toward the front door, each step echoing on the wooden floor. The images on the walls seemed to watch me, as if the house itself were witnessing my escape. When I finally reached the door, I yanked it open. The wood creaked but gave way, and I stepped into the cool night air. The biting wind brought a brief relief, but the image of the man lingered in my mind. As I moved away from the house, a final glance back revealed a silhouette in the upper window, the priest's shadow standing impassively. The house appeared to be just an old, dark building, but I knew it was much more than that. It held secrets that could not be revealed, and perhaps should not be. I left, determined never to return. The house and its pact were a mystery I had no intention of unraveling. That night, as I walked away, I realized there was something beyond mere curiosity. There was a desire to protect not just myself, but everyone who might cross paths with that entity. And as the road stretched out before me, a strange feeling lingered over me. The past never truly dies, and I knew the house would always be there, waiting for someone willing to discover the truth. The night was a dark cloak enveloping the road I was driving on, a lonely serpentine path surrounded by massive trees standing like sentinels. The headlights of my truck cut through the darkness, revealing only a fraction of what lay ahead. The radio was silent, and I could barely hear the engine rumbling, as if the truck itself was hesitant. It was a night like so many others, but an odd sensation began to accompany me. This was a lightly traveled route, and my destination felt distant. I was headed for a small town, a stop that promised a break, but at that moment, it seemed like a potential nightmare. I thought the solitude of the road might bring me some clarity. I looked at the trees on either side, their shapes almost indistinct, shadows that seemed to come alive in the fluctuations of the headlights. There was something unsettling about the way they lined up, as if they were watching me. Maybe I should have taken a different route, I murmured to myself, trying to dispel the growing discomfort settling in. The sound of my voice echoed hollowly in the cabin. I paused, reflecting on how easy it was to let solitude morph into paranoia, but as I drove, something in the atmosphere made me question it. What was really in this part of the world that I didn't understand? The few lights on the road flickered, as if they were warning me. A yellow sign ahead indicated a detour, but I ignored it, determined to stay my course. The urge to keep going pushed me forward, even though a small part of me wanted to turn back. Don't be foolish, I told myself. You're an experienced driver. Yet, as I passed through that isolated stretch, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. There was an almost absolute silence, and suddenly a light breeze flowed through the window, bringing with it the scent of damp earth. An image crossed my mind of something or someone I might encounter there. Doubt washed over me, but I forced myself to ignore it. The road was, after all, just a road. I continued driving, each mile taking me further from what I considered familiar. I thought about the days gone by, the stories told about those forgotten places. Many said roads like this were where the supernatural manifested. Stories to scare children, I thought, recalling conversations with friends. But the truth was, in moments like this, all you want is to believe in logic, in reason. As the fog began to form, a sense of urgency washed over me. The path was narrowing, and the vegetation on each side seemed to encroach, as if trying to wrap around me. The headlights illuminated only a fraction of what lay ahead, and each turn I took felt like it was hiding some secret waiting to be revealed. If only I had a co-pilot, I thought. But that was an idea that didn't sit well with me. There was no one with me. The solitude was my only companion. The rush to get somewhere kept me from noticing the true darkness surrounding me until the radio, previously silent, started emitting strange static. I adjusted the dial, trying to tune into any station, but the interference only grew. And who's there? A voice, or what seemed to be one, came through, followed by a low, distorted laugh. Adrenaline surged through my body, and I gripped the steering wheel, trying to convince myself it was just a technical glitch. Maybe it's the radio wires. This place is weird. But the voice persisted, mixing with the beats of my heart. A wave of unease washed over me. What was happening? The feeling of being watched intensified, and my gaze drifted to the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something back there, a dark silhouette that vanished as soon as I tried to focus. It can't be. It's just your mind playing tricks, I murmured, speeding up. Fear crawled in, and I found myself torn between whether to continue or turn back. But something inside me wouldn't let me stop. I had to find out what was going on. A part of me wanted to retreat, but another part insisted that I press on. What else might I encounter that cursed night? What lay beyond the fog and darkness? That was the dilemma consuming me. The only certainty was that the road ahead was growing increasingly sinister. What should have been a simple trip was beginning to turn into something far more complicated. What was about to happen, I had no idea. But it was a path I was determined to follow. There's something about long, deserted roads that makes me question the choices that brought me here. Maybe I was the kind of person who never learned to say no to a dangerous route or a late-night delivery. I'd always been that way. the driver who accepted the trickiest runs. I don't know if it was stubbornness or a bit of vanity in thinking I was invulnerable. As I drove, I thought about my last conversation with Bill, my closest colleague. He always said that accepting runs to these isolated corners was asking for a ghost story to tell, even if most were just fabrications. People talk too much about these places, he'd say with that tone of someone who knew something I didn't. In that moment, all of it flooded back to me. What would Bill think now? I was alone, and all the courage of a veteran seemed to drain away. Only the sound of the engine kept me alert. The route felt longer than it should. I looked at the GPS, which indicated I was still on the right track, but that only heightened the sense that something was off. The fog enveloped the truck like a curtain, and the scenery around me was a blur of intertwined shadows. Each curve seemed to be followed by another, even tighter one, and without realizing it, I was slowing down, as if expecting something to suddenly appear in front of me. "Breathe," I whispered, trying to calm my racing heart. But at some point, the cabin seemed to heat up, and a drop of sweat trickled down my forehead, a small detail that would normally be a distraction. Yet in this case, it made me realize something else. The clock on the dashboard was wrong. The hand spun in circles as if it had gone mad. I frowned, trying to grasp what was happening, but the discomfort warned me to keep my focus on the road. I was about to grab the radio and call out for someone, anyone, when the voice returned. Only now it was clearer, as if the person were sitting in the passenger seat. "Help me," it said, emotionless but with a firmness that froze me. My mind oscillated between ignoring it or responding, but without even realizing it, I was already murmuring, "Who's there?" The radio fell silent again, and the stillness was almost unbearable. I remembered a story Bill told about drivers who had disappeared on these routes. He spoke of it laughingly, but now, in that stretch, the words carried a different weight. Something about people who never came back, just vanished, as if swallowed by the road. I thought about how I had never paid attention to those tales, and now felt surrounded by them. In the cabin, the lights on the dashboard flickered. It was as if everything around me wanted me to stop, as if the very road was waiting. The voice on the radio was my only company, but I didn't know if I should pay attention or ignore it. Part of me wanted to turn off the radio, but another part wanted answers. What would someone be doing here? Something was strange, but I couldn't quite pin it down. Deep down, I felt that I wasn't as alone as I seemed. In the passenger seat, my backpack, the one I always brought with me, was out of place, as if someone had touched it. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. I had put it there myself. But then, suddenly, a memory flashed in my mind. I had left it on the floor before I left. I stared at the backpack, confused, realizing I was trembling. "Maybe I'm just tired," I murmured. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just fatigue. I took a deep breath and looked at the road ahead, where the headlights barely illuminated anything. The idea that the road might not end felt more like a ridiculous thought I was trying to shake off. All the while, something nagged at me, suggesting there was a reason for my presence here, as if it were some sort of trap I had set for myself. But turning back didn't seem like an option anymore. After all, I wasn't the kind of person who gave up. Bill would definitely laugh at all of this, but in that moment, all I could think about was what he would have done. "Keep driving and ignore what the road shows you," he would say. But it wasn't that simple. The radio fell silent, but the feeling that I wasn't alone lingered. Driving in that fog was already challenging enough, but now the fatigue and confusion made each mile feel like a struggle. I felt like something was waiting for me to slip up, a small distraction that would send me off the edge. The idea that there might be something on this road that was alive, or at least aware of me, seemed less and less absurd. Suddenly, a faint sound pierced the darkness. It sounded like metal scraping against asphalt, a dragging noise, distant yet coming from somewhere ahead. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my eyes glued to the road, searching for anything that might explain the noise. A few meters later, I noticed something that looked like a still silhouette right in the middle of the lane. I flashed my headlights, hoping the figure would move, but it remained stationary. My stomach twisted, and an irrational thought crossed my mind. What if I was heading towards something that didn't belong in this world? Reluctantly, I slowed down, and as I got closer, what appeared to be a human figure started to take shape. It was a man, standing there, dressed in dark clothing with a rigid posture, facing me. I wanted to honk, to warn him, but something held me back. Maybe it was the fact that the figure didn't budge an inch, as if it were waiting for me. In the next instant, the figure simply vanished, as if swallowed by the fog. I blinked repeatedly, trying to process what had just happened. Was I so exhausted that I was starting to hallucinate? But before I could convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, something worse occurred. The radio crackled back to life, but this time the voice wasn't calling for help. It wasn't a wail, it was a faint laughter, almost as if someone were mocking me. "Thought you were alone here?" the voice asked, low and distorted, with a tone that made every hair on my body stand on end. My breath quickened, and my fingers clenched the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Those words, why did they feel so personal, so directed at me? It was impossible for someone to know what I was going through. Bill's stories echoed in my mind, but this time they felt more real than I wanted to admit. I glanced at the GPS. It was frozen, showing a location that I knew should have been several miles behind. My truck seemed stuck on an endless stretch of deserted, foggy road. With each curve, the road seemed to stretch on, keeping the same static landscape in front of me. I could have sworn I had passed that same patch of asphalt multiple times. An endless loop. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last," the voice on the radio continued. I wanted to turn it off, but my arm felt locked, unable to move toward the button. I sat there, trapped, listening to what sounded like a condemnation. Who are you?" My voice came out low, maybe even shaky, but I needed to know. I needed some sign, however small, that this was a prank, some kind of absurd joke. But all I received in return was more laughter. The figure reappeared in the middle of the road, just a few meters ahead, as if it knew exactly where I was looking. This time it was closer, and I could make out some features. The face looked blurred, like a picture out of focus, but the eyes, those eyes had a fierce glint, as if they carried some ancient anger. I swerved the truck, trying to avoid the figure, and almost lost control of the vehicle. The truck skidded, and I felt the weight of the cargo shift, but I managed to regain control and keep moving forward. My heart pounded in my chest, and sweat trickled down my face. Behind me, in the rearview mirror, I saw the figure again, but now it seemed to be laughing. The radio continued to emit that laughter, and the feeling of being hunted intensified. The road felt like it was closing in around me, and I began to question whether I would ever be able to escape. With my eyes fixed on the road ahead, I tried not to look in the mirrors, but the temptation was too great. With each passing second, I felt it drawing closer. "You're not getting out of here," the voice murmured, almost like a sentence. I slammed harder on the accelerator, trying to convince myself that this was all an illusion, a trick of exhaustion, a nightmare that would soon pass. But the road stretched on, the figure kept appearing and disappearing, and the voice on the radio repeated an old, distorted song, as if it knew my sanity was slipping away. With every mile, the radio echoed, "The road always demands its price." As I kept driving, the road felt increasingly surreal. I no longer knew whether it was fatigue or something much worse affecting me, but every detail around me seemed to intensify the dark, oppressive atmosphere. The figure that appeared and vanished on the road wasn't the only enigma haunting me. Gradually, unnoticed details began to reveal themselves, like small hints of a much larger story, something I had been pulled into. I noticed that the cabin was strangely cold, even with the heater on. The sensation wasn't exactly the chill of regular cold, but more like the very presence of something invisible was draining the warmth. I decided to crack the window open a bit, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. However, what came in was a subtle smell of damp earth and something metallic, like rust or old blood. The stories Bill used to tell came back to mind, but now more specifically. He talked about how, on certain roads in the countryside, there were things almost like portals, passages to places where the normal laws of reality simply didn't apply. Once, he told me about a truck driver who vanished after responding to a mysterious call for help. The sinister part was that, months later, that man's family received a radio, the very radio he used to communicate, with a recording of him screaming for help, mentioning a never-ending road. At the time, I had laughed it off, but now, in that oppressive darkness, I realized he might have told me that to warn me. The question now was I trapped on this never-ending road? And if so, how could I get out? I tried to focus on the little I knew about this area. They said some local native tribes had myths about guardian spirits that protected certain places, especially near the mountains. The elders believed that spirits hid in the fog, safeguarding nature from invaders or those traveling with ill intentions. I always found those stories interesting, but more folklore than anything else. Now, those legends seemed to echo in reality, and my desperation was mounting. While still driving, I began to notice a series of old signs, nearly overgrown with brush. They were markers for rest stops that had been closed for a long time. Something told me these rest areas were part of the mystery, that maybe they were points where this never-ending road revealed itself. But stopping to investigate was out of the question. Every instinct told me it was better to keep moving, to give whatever it was no chance to come closer. That's when the radio crackled back to life. This time, there were no laughs or distorted voices. It was a normal radio transmission, an old station playing a classic 60s song that my parents loved. Something comforting, which almost made me lower my guard. The announcer began narrating a story, but I quickly realized he seemed to be describing exactly what I was going through. He mentioned a truck driver, trapped on a forgotten road, pursued by an invisible and constant presence. The announcer then paused, as if he had forgotten what to say, before whispering, "He never got out." The music resumed, but with a disturbing static that drowned everything out. The message was clear. It was almost as if someone, or something, wanted me to know what was coming. And I didn't know if that was a threat or a warning. The landscape around me now seemed denser, with trees and shadows looming through the fog. A faint glow appeared in the distance, like headlights. I decided to floor it, searching for anything that felt familiar, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't headlights. They were small flames, like old lanterns, lined up along the road, guiding me somewhere. I recalled another story from Bill. He had mentioned that to escape these roads, a truck driver once followed a similar pattern of lights. But when he reached the end, he found only a clearing with a circle of stones, like a ritual area. No one ever saw him again. My impulse was to speed up and get out of there, but I also knew that continuing straight ahead, without a clear direction, felt like it was keeping me trapped. Perhaps to escape, I would have to head toward what I feared most. That was the choice left to me. Confront the unknown, or keep wandering endlessly. I was out of options. The faint flames seemed to beckon me, flickering like some kind of marking on the deserted road. It was this, or continue driving in an endless cycle, not knowing if I would ever see an exit. Fear paralyzed me, but something inside me said that the only way to escape was to face the unknown. With my heart racing, I decided to follow those lights. As I got closer, I saw that the flames weren't floating as I had first thought, but were instead fixed to old, rusted iron supports planted alongside the road at precise intervals. It was almost like a procession of lights, a line of fire guiding me toward a destination I still didn't understand. The silence around me was so thick that the sound of the engine felt muffled, as if trapped in a vacuum. The feeling that something was about to happen intensified, something I wouldn't be able to avoid. As I followed those lights, the fog began to part, revealing a detour in the road. It wasn't a normal detour, but rather a narrow path that led into the woods beside it. An old sign, covered in moss and nearly illegible, swayed in the wind. Pulling it slightly to the side, I managed to read the faded words, "Return." The sign seemed to indicate a way out of this nightmare, but the path was dark and appeared to narrow even more as it delved into the forest. I wondered if it was really a return or an even deeper trap. Still hesitant, I turned off the engine for a moment, hoping the silence would provide some answers. That's when I noticed the sound. A low noise, almost like a constant murmuring coming from the forest, a noise that seemed to form whispered words in the wind. My radio crackled again, and this time a soft, almost feminine voice spoke something I didn't catch at first, But as I focused, I realized she was saying, "You've been here before." The phrase hit me like a punch. I couldn't recall any situation in which I had been there, but the certainty with which the voice said it shook my confidence. If I had already passed through here, what did it mean? And more importantly, why couldn't I remember? I decided to follow the path, but with each mile I traveled, it became harder to distinguish what was reality and what was purely the suggestion of my fear. As the trail narrowed, the truck began to sway, and the road became bumpy, forcing me to slow down. That's when I spotted something ahead, a flipped-over truck, partially hidden by the vegetation. The initial shock was replaced by a morbid curiosity, as the vehicle looked exactly like mine. The same marks, the same dents on the side. It was identical, almost like a distorted reflection. I stopped the truck, getting out reluctantly, feeling the weight of the mystery unfolding. I went over to the cabin of the overturned vehicle and peered through the cracked glass. There was no one inside, but one detail disturbed me. On the driver's seat, there was a photo. The photo showed a man who looked a lot like me, sitting behind the wheel of a similar truck. Next to it, a handwritten date faded with time. It was from the previous decade, and the strangest part was that this date coincided exactly with a period I remembered nothing about, a blank space in my memory. A sudden sense of urgency washed over me. I needed to get out of there. I had to return to my own truck and get back on the road before something else happened. But as I turned around, I felt as if I were being watched. Whatever was there, invisible, was getting closer. I hurried back to the truck, my heart racing, and as I turned the engine on, I heard a distinct sound of footsteps approaching, breaking dry branches behind me. As I accelerated, the figure appeared again in the road. But now, closer, clearer. It was the same man from the photo, the same face, but something in his eyes told me he wasn't an ordinary person. He was a reflection of something trapped on that road, something I was starting to understand. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. I read his lips, and the message was clear. It's too late. I swallowed hard, feeling an irrational despair. Even without fully understanding what was happening, one thing was clear. I was being pulled into a cycle I couldn't break free from alone. That's when I remembered an old practice among the older truckers, something Bill had mentioned. Leave a mark on the road, a personal sign that could serve as an anchor to the real world. I took out my pocket knife and etched a small inscription on the side of the dashboard, something that symbolized my desire to return. I was here, and I will get out. The man on the road vanished like a shadow dissolving into the dark, and the flames that had been guiding me began to extinguish one by one, plunging the road into darkness once more. But now, with the symbol marked, I felt I had a thread, a last resort that might help me escape. I accelerated, focusing only on the road ahead, ignoring everything around me. I drove for what felt like an eternity. Every minute was a test of endurance, a battle between the urge to stop and the need to escape. The symbol etched into the dashboard seemed to have some effect, an anchor that somehow kept me alert and focused, but I knew it couldn't last forever. My body was exhausted, and the truck reacted strangely to the road, as if it were heavier, every bump echoing through the vehicle, amplifying the feeling that I was carrying much more than just a load. That's when I noticed the dashboard lights flickering again. A strange tension filled the air, and suddenly, the words, "It's too late," began to resonate in my mind, the phrase echoing like a sinister prophecy. The figure of the man I had seen earlier, the reflection of myself, wouldn't leave my thoughts. It was almost as if he had left a part of himself inside me, a constant presence that only heightened my distress. I pressed the accelerator harder, ignoring any notion of caution. All I wanted was to escape. My heart pounded, and the lights of the road had vanished completely. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the low hum of the radio, which had never felt so oppressive, crackled back to life. But now, the voice I heard wasn't the stranger who had spoken to me before. It was my own, echoing with a cold hopelessness, repeating the phrase, "You won't escape." I tried to turn off the radio, but it insisted on coming back, louder each time. A wave of panic washed over me, and I started to question whether I had really left that deserted road. Was I still trapped in the same place, driving in endless circles without realizing it? I tried to focus on the details around me, searching for a difference, anything that would show I was making progress. But the road remained the same, deserted, endless, devoid of life. As I struggled to maintain my sanity, a headlight began to blink in the distance, an intermittent signal that felt like a warning. I approached, and gradually the outline of another vehicle formed before me. It was a truck, but not just any truck. It was the same overturned truck I had encountered earlier, only now it was upright, parked in the middle of the road, with a red light flashing on its rear, almost like a barrier blocking my way. The sight hit me like a punch to the gut. If that was the same truck, how was it there, intact and functioning? There was something more on that road, something beyond comprehension. I stepped out of my truck with clenched fists, trying to stay calm, but the familiar presence of the unknown lingered around me. I knew I was about to confront something definitive, proof that what I had seen wasn't an illusion. With hesitant steps, I walked up to the cab of the other truck, but to my surprise, it was empty. On the seat, where I had seen a photo before, was now something that seemed more recent, a cap identical to mine. I picked up the cap, feeling its rough fabric in my hands, and that's when I felt a chill. There was something written on the brim, in handwriting that resembled mine. "You've been here before." The revelation was a brutal blow. I couldn't understand how this was possible. It was as if I were living a memory, yet at the same time, it wasn't mine. The sensation of being merely a piece of something larger took hold of me, a cycle of which I seemed to be just a small part. A dense anguish filled me, as if all my attempts to escape were futile. I wasn't just trapped on the road, I was trapped in some kind of time, a cycle I couldn't break free from. I returned to my truck, gasping, feeling the weight of that truth. As I sat in the seat, I saw my reflection in the mirror, and for a moment, I didn't recognize the person there. It was as if something fundamental had been taken from me, something that would never return. The words, "It's too late," seemed written in the air around me, and a dark thought crossed my mind. What if I were just a shadow, a reflection of the person I once was, trapped in that hopeless place? I turned the key in the ignition, but this time the truck hesitated to respond, as if even it was reluctant to continue. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I moved forward, but now without the certainty that there was an escape. The road stretched before me, more desolate than ever, and a sense of inevitability seeped into my thoughts, as if everything I had done up to that point had led me exactly to this moment. The truck advanced through a corridor of shadows and noises, where time felt distorted and every mile traveled was swallowed by an endless darkness. I no longer believed there was an end to this journey. The words I had read on the brim of the cap, "You've been here before," pulsed in my mind like a constant alarm. There was a dark logic to that message, something that echoed every time I tried to rationalize my situation. It was as if I had crossed some invisible boundary, a line separating the real world from a kind of trap, a place where past and present blurred, and where answers slipped away like smoke between my fingers. As I drove, I began to notice details on the road that had previously escaped me. Small marks on the asphalt, scratches on the signs, a tree with bark torn in a strange pattern, signs that perhaps, somehow, I had passed by before, repeatedly, without remembering. Each of these details felt like a clue left by someone, perhaps by me, trying to alert me to something that now completely eluded me. The radio, which I had turned off after the last episodes, began to function again on its own, crackling and emitting fragments of static and indistinct voices. The words came and went in a nearly hypnotic rhythm, but they were no longer threats or warnings. It was like a conversation between two strangers, discussions about trivial things mixed with disconnected phrases and strange laughter. I couldn't understand everything, but some phrases struck me with a disturbing clarity. "They never leave here. A road without a beginning or an end. He still thinks he can escape." The conversation on the radio intensified, growing clearer and more unsettling. That feeling of being watched solidified, and it was as if I weren't the only one listening, but also the target of that conversation. What had seemed like a strange, mundane talk soon became an analysis of my situation, detailing my attempts to flee, my decisions, almost as if those talking on the radio were tracking my every move, commenting on my determination to keep going. At that moment, the dashboard lights flickered again, and I saw a shadow in the rearview mirror, quickly fading, but I couldn't ignore it. That figure was no longer an unknown image. It was myself I saw, but a distorted reflection, like a version of me that in some way was no longer fully human. I froze. I saw myself pressed against the rear window of the truck, watching me with eyes that seemed empty, as if the person I once was had been left behind, trapped in that place. I slammed the truck to a halt, the sound of the tires screeching against the asphalt, echoing in the vastness of the road. My breathing was erratic, and I knew I had to confront that distorted version of myself, understand what was happening, even if the truth was more terrifying than I could bear. I got out of the truck and walked slowly to the back, as if an invisible force was guiding me. The moment I reached the back, I was hit by an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, a feeling so familiar and yet so distant it almost felt like a dream. As I opened the door, I found something that made me shudder. In the empty space where the cargo should have been, I saw the mirrored interior of the very truck I was driving. It was as if the vehicle were an extension of myself, and at the same time, a prison where my own image was doomed to wander aimlessly. There were a series of familiar marks and objects scattered inside, things I knew I had seen before, but had never known how to explain. Among those objects was a framed photo of me, an old portrait I didn't even remember taking, but there it was, like a reminder of the life I had lost. Every detail of that reflection gave me a sense of total disconnection, as if the truck and I were one entity, one presence, destined to wander that endless road. The weight of reality hit me with brutal clarity. That cycle, that distorted space-time, was not a coincidence but a trap. I was both the prisoner and the warden. I slammed the door shut and returned to the driver's seat. I noticed the radio had gone silent, and the only sound I could hear was my own breathing. There, before I turned the key once more, I understood that to escape, I needed to confront not what was on the road, but what was within myself. I sat in the truck seat with trembling hands firmly gripping the steering wheel, staring intently at the empty road ahead. The feeling of déjà vu, which until then seemed confusing and distorted, now made an almost unbearable sense. I was trapped, not in a physical place, but in something that felt like it existed within me, a never-ending repetition of a story in which I was the sole character. Like a ghost wandering without understanding that had left the world, I was the only one who couldn't see. There was no endpoint. It was as if the road were a fragment of my own mind, a space where all my fears, frustrations, and regrets took shape and kept me imprisoned. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to focus. I needed to break free from this, to find a real way out. Opening my eyes again, I saw him, that distorted reflection in the rearview mirror, the other version of me, silently watching. His eyes looked lifeless, as if something was missing, a darkness I recognized well but had never wanted to face. "Who are you?" My voice came out low and hoarse, laced with a mix of fear and resignation. The reflection didn't respond, but it was as if I knew what it wanted to say. A profound, painful understanding that needed no words. He was there to make me confront everything I had been running from, every decision and memory that had brought me to this point. I felt that the answer lay in something I had insisted on ignoring. But now, there, in the presence of that ghostly version of myself, I could no longer avoid it. I rummaged through the truck, searching for anything that could give me an answer, until my eyes fell upon something I hadn't noticed before. A yellowed envelope stuck in the glove compartment, with my name written in a familiar but almost forgotten handwriting. I opened the envelope with my still trembling hands and pulled out a letter, written in a handwriting that looked like mine, but with something strange about it. "Do you remember when this began?" the letter asked. "How many times you've traveled this same road, trying to find a destination that always slips away? You always thought it was just the truck, the road, the messages, but it was never that. The real prison is in what you refuse to accept." I read those words over and over, each sentence sinking deeper and deeper. What was it that I refused to accept? What was on that road that I was being forced to relive? My memories came and went, fragmented, until a specific image surfaced clearly, the last time I had made that route with someone beside me, a figure both familiar and painful to recall. Images of my life before that road, of mistakes and omissions, of the rush to leave certain memories behind, began to swirl in my mind. I had a life before this endless journey, but I had let it slip away just as easily as one loses a road in the fog. The reflection in the mirror, my other self, stared back at me with a mix of compassion and judgment, as if saying he knew exactly what I was avoiding. "If you want to get out, you need to leave this part of yourself behind," he murmured, finally breaking the silence. It was a simple phrase, but it carried an almost unbearable weight. That other version of myself knew what was needed to set me free. I would have to confront my own regrets, accept the choices I had made, and perhaps leave a part of myself trapped there forever. Deep down, I knew that was the truth, yet part of me clung to what had been, to what could have been, unable to break free from the past. I closed my eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, and then made a decision. I was going to leave that road, even if it meant abandoning part of myself. I turned the key in the truck with a new resolve, feeling something begin to shift around me. The landscape, once immutable and suffocating, started to distort, the streetlights along the road flickering and disappearing one by one. I drove with a determination I hadn't felt in a long time, knowing this would be my last journey there. I could feel the reflection watching me, each mile, as if it knew this was our final farewell. As I moved forward, the edges of the road began to dissolve into a deep darkness, but this time there was a point of light ahead, a distant horizon like a promise of freedom. Finally, I saw the end of the road approaching, an exit opening like a passage to a new beginning. I knew that crossing that boundary meant there would be no turning back. I glanced one last time at the reflection in the mirror, the version of me that would remain there, on that road, as a guardian of my own past choices. "Thank you," I whispered, unsure if he would hear. As I crossed the final line, I felt an immense weight lift from my shoulders, as if I were truly leaving something important behind. It was the sensation of freedom, of breaking that endless cycle. The road vanished behind me, and the truck moved toward a new path, with an open sky above, free from the shadows of the past. As I rounded the last curve, a strange peace enveloped the truck, as if I were finally free from the road that had imprisoned me. The engine purred steadily, and for the first time, it felt like the route was following its natural flow. There were no more figures around, nor distortions in the mirror. The sky gradually brightened, a gentle glow appearing on the horizon like the start of a new dawn. Each mile was a firm step toward freedom, a relief to leave behind the stretch that felt endless. My memories, once like anchors, were now just fragments I felt I could leave on the side of that road. I accepted that the past, the mistakes, the losses, the moments that left scars, was part of my story, but it didn't need to dictate every move I made from that point on. Suddenly I turned off the radio. The sound of the engine and the steady glide of the truck were enough. For the first time, what lay ahead had its own meaning, independent of the torment I carried with me. I had no idea what I would find, but that didn't matter. The road seemed to offer me a second chance, a fresh start on a path where I wouldn't look back. For a moment, I thought about the reflection that had haunted me. It was still there, a figure trapped in the past, perhaps waiting for me to return, but I knew I wouldn't go back. Something on that journey had resolved itself, something words couldn't explain, but which had become a sort of farewell. Now it, or whatever it was, would remain on the road I had left behind. A part of me, but with no power over what I would choose from then on. As I drove, I felt the lightness of the journey, the natural flow of a new phase. Everything felt clear, simple. Even if I never fully understood what I had experienced, what truly mattered was what I would do from that point on. I had a vivid sense that the events of that journey didn't need explanation. My life, up until that point, had been marked by shadows and repetitions, but now I was ready to move forward, unafraid of where the road would take me. With the sun rising slowly and the horizon glowing, a light smile emerged. I allowed myself to feel that, for the first time in a long time, I was truly moving ahead. Months later, I still reflected on the experience on that deserted road. Every time I got behind the wheel, The image of my reflection lingered somewhere in my mind, but in a more distant way. Sometimes, stories would arise about that particular road, legends of drivers who swore they had seen something or someone. I never spoke up, I just listened and let the conversation flow. At that point, discussing it felt unnecessary. The most curious thing was that since then, I started to notice small changes in how I approached each trip. It wasn't the old fears that accompanied me, but rather a sort of acknowledgement of the marks left by the road. I found a sense of peace in traversing new paths, crossing lands and destinations with a tranquil acceptance. The last time I passed through that same area, I slowed down, letting my gaze wander along the road at night. Nothing unusual, just the familiar landscape and the comforting sound of the engine. That reflection, the shadows, and the weight they carried, all were left behind. Everyone in Greenfield knew the legend of the Holloway House. The decrepit mansion sat isolated at the end of a dead-end street. Its dark windows, peeling paint, and aging structure seemed to tell stories that no one in their right mind wanted to investigate. Since we were kids, we were told to keep our distance, and the rumor was that anyone who entered wouldn't come out the same. Many claimed to hear voices or see figures in the windows. Still, I, Justin Turner, never really believed it. I had a more practical view. Scary stories were great for keeping kids away from dangerous places, but to me, the Holloway House was just an abandoned building. So I decided to prove there was nothing supernatural about it. I invited Danny and Mike to go with me. We brought a few flashlights and the camera Danny had managed to get his hands on. When we arrived, we stopped in front of the rusty gate. The trees around cast shadows everywhere, giving the place an even more intimidating look. Mike, always the most nervous, muttered that maybe this was a bad idea, but he wasn't leaving without a push. I opened the gate, and the metallic creak cut through the air, almost like a warning not to go further. We went on, and as we crossed the entrance, a low, distant sound broke the silence. Our flashlights revealed a dust-covered interior with cracked walls and peeling wallpaper hanging down. The wooden floor creaked with every step, and the smell of dampness was strong. We went up the stairs, feeling the tension building. When we reached the second floor, we found something unexpected, an old rocking chair facing a window, rocking slowly. Danny was filming, and the camera was focused on the chair. Mike made a nervous joke, but we quickly got serious when we heard heavy footsteps coming from the attic. A chill ran through us, but we stayed together. We knew from that point on, the night wouldn't be as simple as we'd thought. That night, every room in the Holloway house was a mystery to us. The peeling walls and aged structure gave the house a worn-out look, like it was trapped in another time. Danny, Mike, and I tried to keep things light, but tension was everywhere. With the camera in hand, Danny recorded every detail as we crossed the main hallway, where the dirty, almost opaque windows left our flashlight beams as the only clear light inside. The rocking chair was there, with faint marks on the floor indicating it had been moved recently. It rocked back and forth, subtly, until it stilled, as if our presence was enough to stop it. I exchanged a quick look with Danny, who swallowed hard and refocused the camera. Mike, nervous, suggested we wrap it up, but we weren't ready to turn back. More than anything, we wanted to understand what drew us to that house. The second floor had an odd layout, with small bedrooms and an old bathroom, decorated with cracked tiles and a mirror clouded by time. Every door we opened revealed a different, equally oppressive scene. While we were investigating, we heard that distinct sound again, coming from the attic, a cross between shuffling feet and almost human movement. The hesitation on Mike's face was clear, but he held his ground. I looked at the attic entrance, a small door in the ceiling with a rope to pull, weighing whether it was worth going further. "Let's finish this once and for all," Danny whispered. I pulled the cord to the attic entrance, releasing the ladder that slowly creaked down. The sound of the old wood groaning filled the floor as we all kept our eyes fixed on the access, bracing for the worst. Danny lit the way with his flashlight and suggested Mike go first. Reluctantly, he climbed the ladder while Danny and I waited right below. The attic was a cramped space, packed with boxes and old furniture, piled together in a haphazard way. Mike climbed up cautiously, shining his light around. In just a few seconds, he froze, staring at something we couldn't yet see. "There's someone there," he murmured, his voice low, trembling with a fear that was unusual for him. Danny's camera recorded every second, capturing the terror that spread across Mike's face. He quickly scrambled down, shaking, and pulled us toward the exit. As we tried to leave, we were in for a shock. The door we'd come through was inexplicably locked. We tugged at the handle, tried forcing the door open, but it was useless. Every attempt seemed pointless. Danny looked at me, suggesting we try the windows as an alternative exit, but they were all sealed. The camera continued recording every moment until an electrical glitch started interfering, causing the device to flicker off. I looked down the hall and saw a distinct shadow, a figure standing beside the armchair. It didn't move, but its presence filled the space. With hearts pounding and panic spreading through the group, we tried the door again as Danny's equipment lost its image. Suddenly, the camera died, leaving us trapped with no clear way out. With the camera completely dead and the door locked, the situation morphed into a nightmare. The tension that had been heavy was now suffocating, and the three of us exchanged nervous glances. Danny, still gripping the flashlight, began sweeping it around the space, illuminating details as we tried to come up with a plan. "There has to be a way out," Mike said, his voice thick with anxiety. He started looking for a window, but each one was sealed shut, as if the building itself had decided to trap us. "Someone has to go back up to the attic. There must be another way out up there," I suggested, trying to sound braver than I felt. But the thought of going back into that attic, where Mike had seen the figure, was terrifying. "Are you out of your mind? Whatever Mike saw is up there," Danny replied, waving the flashlight. I knew he was right, but we had no other choice. The situation was only getting worse. The darkness seemed to be closing in us, and the feeling of being watched intensified. "Let's stick together," I declared. "If anything happens, at least we'll all be here." The decision was made. With hearts pounding, we started up the stairs toward the attic again, with Mike leading and Danny lighting the way. The attic was like a cave of relics from the past. The walls were covered in a thick layer of dust, and the musty smell permeated the air. The flashlight revealed a mass of forgotten items, dusty boxes, broken furniture, and a worn-out piano that seemed to have seen better days. I scanned the room, searching for any clue about the presence Mike had seen. "Look," Danny shouted, pointing to a spot in the corner where the flashlight couldn't quite reach. There was a pile of debris that looked like it had been recently disturbed. Adrenaline shot through me, and I cautiously approached. The idea that something might be hidden there made me uneasy, but there was no turning back now. Slowly, we began sifting through the rubble, but all we found were broken objects and more dust. The unease only grew. Then we heard footsteps again, closer this time, and a chill shot down my spine. "We need to get out, now," Mike shouted, but his voice barely broke through the thick, oppressive air. That's when we realized it. The attic entrance was slowly closing, as if the house itself was trying to consume us. In a surge of panic, we started pushing against the door, but it was stuck, like an invisible force was holding it shut. The pressure mounted every second, and our efforts to force it open became frantic. "Focus. We need to think of another way out," Danny said, his voice now filled with determination, though I could sense his courage waning. I looked around, desperately searching for any sign of escape. The attic, once just a dark space, now felt like a maze of threats. A small hole in the ceiling caught my attention. "Maybe we can get out through there." I wasn't even sure if there was anything on the other side, but it was a chance. "Let's stack the boxes and try to reach it," I suggested. Quickly, we built a makeshift ladder, and with a lot of effort, I managed to reach the hole. "Jump!" I shouted to Mike and Danny, but what should have been hope turned to dread. As I struggled to balance and peer into the hole, Danny's flashlight started flickering, casting shadows everywhere. I glanced to the far end of the attic and felt something moving. A presence, once only a rumor, was now tangible. "No!" Mike yelled, and when I turned, the figure was closer than ever. It was indistinct, but its eyes gleamed in the darkness, and a wave of despair washed over me. Without thinking, I jumped back, knocking over boxes and making an even bigger mess. The noise echoed through the attic, and the figure began to move slowly forward. The door was still locked, but the sheer panic had bonded us in an unexpected way. "Let's push the door together," Danny said. In a coordinated effort, we braced ourselves and, with all our strength, pushed against the door. The crash was deafening. The door's boards started to give, and in one final effort, we forced it open. We stumbled through the door and raced down the stairs without looking back. The house was now alive with sounds, and the air seemed to vibrate around us. The hallway led us back to the first floor, where the main entrance awaited us, still locked, but the feeling of terror and the certainty that we were no longer welcome urged us onward. When we reached the front door, we locked it shut and pushed against it, moonlight streaming through the windows. Finally, as we stepped outside, a sense of relief mixed with the fear of the unknown washed over us. I looked at my friends, their faces pale and eyes wide, reflecting what had just happened. The Holloway house, now a living memory of a nightmare, slowly faded behind us. But what had we encountered? What had actually moved in the darkness? Each step toward the car was a fight against the urge to look back, and the feeling that something in the house watched our departure would never leave me. As we drove away from Holloway House, adrenaline still pumped through my veins. The fear of what had happened and the uncertainty about the figure in the attic blended with the relief of being out of that place. I looked over at Mike and Danny, each of us coping in our own way. The weight of the experience had hit us differently, and I knew that night would mark a turning point in our lives and beliefs. As we drove back home, I couldn't help but think about how this experience connected to an unresolved grief in my life. When I was only 10, I lost my grandfather, a man who always believed in ghost stories and hauntings. He used to tell me about a spirit that protected his home, and I'd listen in fascination, assuming his imagination was the only thing keeping him afloat. The thought that he might have been right, that the supernatural might be real, left me uneasy. That night, a part of me wondered if, by entering the Holloway house, I had been too quick to dismiss the beliefs Mike held so dear. My need to prove it was all a hoax, my skepticism, had turned into a need to understand what was really hidden in that house. Mike's expression, still pale, reminded me of how I had failed to protect him, and that weighed heavily on me. He stared out the window, clearly lost in thought, and I wondered if he was revisiting his own demons. At school, weeks after the incident, things changed. The story of the Holloway house spread like wildfire. We were no longer just three friends who had decided to explore an abandoned place. We became known as the kids who challenged the haunted house. Conversations in the halls, the constant retelling of our experience, felt like an echo we couldn't escape. But even as everyone talked about what happened, few knew the truth. Danny, my best friend since childhood, started to drift away from me. He often avoided our lunches together, and instead of asking me questions, he withdrew, talking to other classmates. I sensed he was hiding something, and it only increased my unease. One night, I couldn't hold back and called him. I asked directly if something was wrong, but he sidestepped, saying he was busy. Frustration simmered in me, but I didn't know how to reach him. It was Mike who decided we needed to confront things. "Justin, we can't leave it like this. We need to talk to Danny and clear the air. I don't want to lose a friend over something terrible that we all went through." With those words, my spirits lifted a bit. Our friendship had always meant more than any adventure we could have had. We arranged to meet at our favorite coffee shop. When Danny arrived, I noticed he was more nervous than usual. He sat down, and silence hung between us. "Look, Danny," I started. "We know the house affected us, but we can't let it ruin our friendship. What's going on?" He hesitated before answering. I haven't been able to stop seeing that figure. It wasn't just a hallucination, it was real, and every time I close my eyes, it's there again." The despair in his voice made my heart race. It wasn't just the trauma of the experience, but a deeper fear, something he couldn't name. With that, the dialogue flowed. I talked about my grandfather, how his ghost stories had always left a mark on me. Mike shared his own insecurities, revealing he'd always been afraid of the dark. The conversation became a safe space where we could express our vulnerabilities. We weren't just three teenagers anymore, but friends battling past demons and present uncertainties. After that meeting, things shifted between us. Though there was still an undertone of discomfort about the experience at Holloway House, our bond felt stronger. We decided not to let the past define our future. As the days turned into weeks, I realized the legend of the Holloway House had become a symbol of something bigger. For me, the house wasn't just a terrifying place, it was a lesson. It reminded me that sometimes we need to face our fears instead of dodging them. What had started as a simple exploration turned into a journey of self-discovery. While the story spread around school and people continued to avoid the house, we didn't. The legend became a part of us, another layer in our lives. Instead of letting it paralyze us, we chose to confront it head-on. And so, Holloway House, in its decay, became a symbol of friendship, growth, and facing fears. Days turned to weeks, and the atmosphere in Greenfield seemed different. The Holloway House was still a topic of conversation, but for me, Mike and Danny, the story had become something personal. We had chosen to leave the past behind, but whatever we'd experienced that night still lingered like a shadow. A month after our visit to the house, something unexpected happened. We were at school, all gathered during break. Mike was telling a joke about the math teacher when, suddenly, the fire alarm went off. The deafening sound filled the hallways, and students started moving toward the exits. At first, I didn't think much of it. Fire drills were common. But as we headed outside, a sense of unease started to settle in. Once we reached the parking lot, I saw a group of students gathered around a fire truck. One of them, Sam, was gesturing excitedly. He turned to us, eyes gleaming with the excitement of delivering a juicy story. "Guys, you won't believe this. Someone found something at the Holloway House." My heart pounded. "Found what?" I asked, anxiety mixing with curiosity. "A body," Sam announced, as if dropping the biggest bombshell in town. A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. A demolition crew went in to inspect the place and found a decomposing body in the basement. The revelation hit me like a punch. I looked at Mike and Danny, and they looked equally stunned. Was this why the town avoided Holloway House? What else could be hidden inside? I went home that afternoon in a daze. The image of a lost life, someone who had been in a place we knew so well, hovered over me. The house, once just a crumbling structure, now became a symbol of tragedy. And, inexplicably, I felt guilty. What might we have found if we'd gone deeper that night? If we'd explored the attic, what would we have discovered? Then, the idea of returning to the house became an obsession. This wasn't just youthful curiosity. It was a need to face what we hadn't faced before. I wanted to understand the connection between what we had experienced and what was now a concrete tragedy. I reached out to Mike and Danny, suggesting we go back to Holloway House. "Are you out of your mind?" Mike exclaimed, his face a mixture of fear and disbelief. "That place is a death trap now. We need to leave it behind." Danny, however, was more contemplative. "If they found a body there, maybe it's our responsibility to know more. We can't just ignore this." Deep down, I knew part of my motivation was to prove that what we'd gone through was more than just coincidence. A part of me believed we could find answers, an explanation that would bring some sense to the chaos that had invaded our lives. After much debate, we decided to go together. What had once been a naive exploration had turned into a search for answers. We set a date to go at night, armed with flashlights and cameras, determined to document whatever we found. There was a sense of camaraderie between us. It was more than just facing our fears. It was about solidifying our friendship around an event that had bound us together. When we arrived at the house, the darkness felt heavier than the last time. The beams from our flashlights cast familiar shapes, creating a surreal effect. As we entered, a tense atmosphere enveloped us. The smell of mold and decay was still present, but there was something more now, a sense of history, of something that had stayed hidden for a long time. Navigating through the house, we decided to start in the basement, where the body had been found. The stairs were a maze of dust and debris, and the sound of our footsteps echoed as we descended. A sense of unease followed me, but I was determined to uncover the truth. When we reached the basement, the darkness was almost tangible. The walls were damp, and the floor uneven and cold. With our flashlights, we scanned the space, revealing broken furniture and dust-covered boxes. But what caught my attention most were the remnants left behind. Personal items, faded photos, and torn letters. It felt like we were intruding on someone's private life, someone who no longer had a voice. As we examined the items, something caught my eye. In a corner, a wooden box sat partially open. I went over and lifted the lid, revealing a collection of photos and journals. One of the journals was torn, but I managed to read fragments that spoke of loneliness, pain, and a deep desire to be heard. The feelings expressed on those pages resonated with me. It was the voice of someone who had suffered and somehow still lingered among the ruins. As I flipped through the pages, a noise sounded from above, a creak, then another. The atmosphere grew tense, and what I'd read began pressing on my mind. I looked at Mike and Danny, who seemed just as unsettled as I was. Before we could discuss what to do, a shadow passed quickly across the basement doorway. My heart pounded. "Is someone there?" I called, my voice shaking. The only response was the place's empty silence. There was no turning back. I knew we were about to cross the line between what was real and what was imagined. We had delved into the depths of the Holloway house's history, and now we needed to face whatever had called us here. With a mix of curiosity and fear, we followed the sound, which seemed to intensify. Our flashlights started flickering. In that moment, I realized what had begun as a simple exploration had turned into a quest for truth. Whatever we found in that house could change everything. The darkness ahead deepened, but we had no choice. We had to find out what was waiting for us. That night, we arrived with a sense that something deeper was waiting. We had read the diary in the basement, found personal items scattered like fragments of a life marked by pain. Even without words, we understood that we were standing before something that, in a way, demanded our presence. This time, we came more prepared. Armed with new flashlights and cameras, we went over the plan to explore each floor of the house, starting with the basement, where the echoes of that lost life still felt the strongest. Since we'd first set foot there, it was hard to shake the feeling that every part of that house hid something, a memory, a scene waiting to be uncovered. As we descended the stairs to the basement, Mike was the first to switch on his camera. I was right behind him, holding the flashlight, with Danny close behind in silence, which was unusual for him. The place felt even darker than before, with an air of anticipation we hadn't felt in our previous visits. The first thing we found was the same box with the photos and journals. This time, though, it wasn't the box's contents that held our attention, but something beside it. A mark on the floor, an old stain that, under other circumstances, might have gone unnoticed. It was hard to say if it had been there before, but now it seemed strangely significant. Danny's flashlight focused on it, casting a cold, revealing glow. Mike, still holding the camera, muttered something, and suddenly he, too, noticed how fresh it seemed. Memories of that story began to resurface in my mind, as if what we'd found was a message not just about what had happened in that house, but about why we'd been drawn there. We decided then to focus on the journals and letters we'd found on our first visit. Among the scribbled words were incomplete messages, but they all conveyed a desire to be remembered, a sort of plea to anyone who would find those pages. "Are we understanding this right?" Mike asked, flipping through the pages. One line in particular caught my attention. "The truth cannot be buried. It always finds a way to return." It was written in fine handwriting, as if it had been added at the very end on a torn page. Did he know no one would listen? I asked, trying to interpret the weight of that message. Danny took a deep breath, and this time, his face showed a determination that hadn't been there before. "Maybe the truth needs witnesses," he said, with a tone that left no doubt he was serious. For the first time, I felt we were on the same page about what we were about to do. We climbed the stairs again, but now the atmosphere was more charged, as if the house had become aware of our presence. With each step, the walls seemed to close in, and the darkness around us felt almost like a physical presence. Our eyes met more than once, no words needed. We were in new territory, and the sense that we were no longer alone, that someone or something knew we were there, was undeniable. Reaching the upper floor, a new question began to surface. What if what we were looking for, the reason we'd been drawn there, wasn't just a mystery? What if, instead of what we'd imagined, there was something more specific? a kind of revelation that could only occur in the presence of witnesses. We explored every corner, scanning the place with heightened awareness. Every sound, every crack we illuminated with our flashlights seemed to be guiding us closer to a truth we were hesitant to face. In a moment of courage, Danny suggested we should leave something of ours in the house, a gesture that would mark our presence there, like a symbolic pact with the place. It felt strange, maybe, but in that moment, it made sense. I took my pen and left it on the table where we'd found the journal the first time. It was like an exchange, something of ours for something of his. As I did this, a noise came from the upstairs floor. I looked at the guys who had expressions of anticipation. This wasn't just a youthful adventure anymore. It had become a real connection to that space, and we were ready to face whatever it had in store for us. We geared up, adjusting our bags and gripping our flashlights tighter. We were ready to head up again, this time to what we knew would be a final encounter. That night felt like the culmination of everything we'd been through. As we prepared to enter the attic, the weight of the moment was undeniable. Whatever waited for us, there was more than just another ghost story. It was the peak of something that demanded answers, a finale that would be hard to believe. With flashlights aimed at the wooden stairs leading up, Danny was the first to climb. His hands were steady, but I noticed a hint of caution in his eyes. Mike followed right behind, holding the camera with a determined grip. I brought up the rear, trying to keep the flashlight steady as we climbed. Each step creaked loudly, amplifying the sense of anticipation in the heavy silence around us. We didn't speak. We all knew what we were after. A resolution, or at least some kind of closure. At the top, the air was different, thicker, and the space gave off a chilling aura of abandonment. The angled walls and worn wooden floor created a cramped, almost claustrophobic space. In the middle of the room, where a broken window let in a sliver of moonlight, we knew this was where it would all come to a head. Then we saw something in the corner. Danny directed his light towards it, revealing a figure seated in an old armchair facing us. The cold air seemed to vanish in an instant, but none of us moved back. Mike raised the camera, starting to record, while I held the flashlight steady on the figure, refusing to look away. The figure didn't move, but the posture was alarmingly real. The details were vivid. A hunched form, wrinkled hands resting on the chair's arms, head slightly lowered as if waiting. I felt an urge to speak, but the tension kept my voice locked. It was as though we were waiting for it to speak first. On impulse, Danny stepped closer. "Who are you?" he murmured, his voice steady, but with an undertone of hesitation. The figure didn't answer, but a slight tilt of its head sent my heart racing. It was listening. Suddenly, a low noise began filling the room. It was hard to pinpoint what it was, but it seemed to echo through the space. Mike turned the camera towards the sound, and Danny took a step back, his face darkening. I kept the flashlight trained on the figure, but the air seemed to throb with an energy we couldn't control. Then I realized the figure was standing, though I hadn't seen it move. It stood straight, facing us, and that's when I saw the eyes, fixed, intense, yet hollow, as if looking right through us. Without warning, the chair behind it slid back, scraping slowly until it pressed against the wall. At that moment, I knew we'd crossed a line, that this wasn't some mystery or hallucination. The figure took a step forward, and its presence filled the room, leaving us practically frozen. Mike, still filming, began mumbling something about the history we'd uncovered. "Are you from the Holloway family?" he asked, not really expecting an answer. But the figure inclined its head, as if it recognized something in those words. A sliver of understanding passed between us, a fragment that only intensified the fear. Slowly, the figure raised one hand, pointing toward the attic's corner, where some scattered papers lay. Danny, hesitant, went over and picked one up, handing it to me to see. It was an old newspaper clipping, detailing the tragic history of the Holloways, a sudden death, the loss of a loved one. And as if that memory wasn't enough, the room started pulsing again, an intense pressure that seemed to rise from the floor. The figure, now closer, left no doubt. We were face to face with a manifestation of grief, of loss, seeking answers. We felt we had been summoned there to witness a forgotten story brought back to life. Mike, sensing it too, lowered the camera, as if recording no longer mattered. Now, it was about acknowledging what was in front of us. Danny was the first to move toward the exit. Without a word, he descended the stairs, keeping his gaze fixed on the figure, which was once again still, seated as before, but with an expression that showed some measure of peace. It seemed that by witnessing its story, we'd fulfilled a purpose. Mike and I followed Danny in silence, heading down the stairs to the ground floor. None of us looked back. As we crossed the threshold, the door shut gently behind us, with no sound or resistance. When we reached the street, the sky was clear, and Greenfield looked like the same sleepy town as always. Only once we got to the car did we exchange glances, realizing that the house had become much more than an adventure to prove opposing opinions. When we left the Holloway that night, each of us carried something indescribable. It wasn't just the memory of what we'd seen, but an impression, a certainty that none of it would leave us easily. As we re-entered Greenfield, silently trying to process the strangeness of it all, the discomfort reminded us that we'd crossed a boundary and were now part of the house's story. The next morning, we avoided discussing what we'd seen, attempting to get back to routine. However, the day carried a lingering sense that something was watching us. Meanwhile, the memories of that night began to blur in my mind. When I reviewed the footage, it was sharp up to the point when we heard the attic noise. From there, the recording became fragmented, as if some invisible force had tampered with it. Strangely, at a specific point, a shadow appeared in the background, motionless, nearly hidden in the gloom. Danny, always the skeptic, refused to watch the footage to the end. Mike, however, watched it over and over, trying to find some logic in what we witnessed. But eventually, he too gave up, confessing that each time he watched it, he saw something new, as if the video itself changed with every viewing. That's when we began to understand that the Holloway wasn't just a story, it was an experience that refused to remain in the past. People in town soon knew we'd gone into the house. Some treated us like heroes who defied the legend, while others avoided us as if we carried some curse. Still, it was impossible to shake the pull of that unresolved mystery. As much as we tried to move on, memories of the figure in the attic, the solitary chair, the newspaper clipping stayed with us. Months later, Mike suggested going back to the house for one last investigation, but Danny and I declined. We sensed that by leaving that first night, we'd already taken enough with us. Besides, we shared an unspoken understanding. Some secrets are meant to stay put, like silent parts of a small town's history. Eventually, we tried to leave the Holloway's legend in peace. Greenfield continued on, and for those who never dared to enter, the house remained an urban legend, a dark warning for the curious. But for us, it left something deep and inexplicable. We had entered skeptics and left with the certainty that there were things in the world beyond our control or understanding. Even now, when I pass that street and see the Holloway in the distance, I can't resist a glance toward its dusty windows, as if someone's watching from inside, still waiting. After that night, we could never fully leave the Holloway behind. It became a presence, a weight we carried, though we avoided speaking of it among ourselves. Mike moved away months later, saying he needed space. Danny and I stayed in Greenfield, but our friendship changed. We shared something we didn't want to revisit. Years passed, and the Holloway was finally torn down. They said it was to make way for new projects, but for us, it was a way for the town to try to erase what it would never understand. Yet the feeling that something from that house lingered in the shadows persisted. In dreams, we relived each detail of that night. The attic, the sound of footsteps, the figure standing there, always watching, always present. Now, when people ask about the old Holloway, I change the subject. I let the legend spread without interfering. Somehow, I know that experience hasn't ended. The house may be gone, but the stories, the marks, remain, and Mike, Danny, and I continue to carry a dark memory that can never be demolished.